All right, I apologize to those people on Zoom that you were not hearing Darren. I don't know if you want to try to start over or not, or whatever you want to do.
Ask for a
Okay.
thumbs up, Jay.
Everybody can hear me now and see? Okay, thank you. All right, Darren.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I went through this process of learning the oral history from my grandmother, May Timbuktu Parry. She would sit for hours and she'd tell me stories about how the coyote stole fire or how the bald eagle became bald. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eyes, she would relate the story of the massacre at Bo-Ogai. There's an old Indian saying that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And that was never as true as it was about my grandmother. As I grew older and I attended school, I developed this great love for history. And then sitting in history class one day, I suddenly realized something. None of the stories that my grandmother told me are in our history books. How could that be? I'd always believed that historical events weren't absolute. I believed that events that transpired over time had only one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I read a quote that was attributed to Winston Churchill, the great English leader, who said, history is only written by the victors. Well, that makes perfect sense then, why Native American histories are seldom written. My great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Sagwitch, and his Shoshone people lived like their forefathers had lived. They were hunters and gatherers. They traveled with the changing seasons. They looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that they called her mother. She was always the provider of our livelihood. You see, to my native people, the mountains and the streams and the plains stand forever, and seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different parts of this area when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. If you can imagine, it was a hard way of life. I'm sure they were never more than a few days away from starvation, but it was a happy life. Back then, every member of the tribe played an important role in its survival. That family relationship was sacred, as it should be to you and your family. In the summer of 1847, Sagwitch received word that a group of settlers were making their way through Wyoming and heading towards the Salt Lake Valley. And on July 31st, Sagwitch traveled to Salt Lake with 10 of his men in hopes to meet Brigham Young. Now, because of his illness, they did not meet with Brigham Young that day. They met with a man named Heber C. Kimball. At the conclusion of that meeting, Heber C. Kimball said this: "The lands do not belong to you. They belong to the Lord. And we calculate to plow and plant it." If you can imagine, Sagwitch, as he returned home that day, probably had thoughts in his mind about how his life and how the life of his people were about to get complicated. Over the next few years, as more and more saints arrived to this beautiful valley, good land was now becoming scarce. It was then that Brigham Young sent a man named Peter Mon north to the Cache Valley, where I live today, to settle that for good. In those early days, Peter Mon and those early saints in the Cache Valley referred to Sagwitch and his band as the friendly ones. As more and more saints arrived to that beautiful valley and resources began to become depleted, they began to describe us as thieves and beggars, which was probably true from their perspective. The irony, though, in that for me, is that the saints themselves had suffered so much hate and injustice on their trek across this country. It's hard for me to believe that they could be found guilty of doing the same thing to my people. Peter Mon, who is now the area authority in the Cache Valley, said this: "With extraordinarily good luck, the California volunteers will completely wipe them out. We wish this community rid of all such parties. And if Colonel Connor can be successful in reaching that bastard class of humans who play with the lives of the peaceable and the law-abiding citizens in this way, we shall be pleased to acknowledge our obligations." So with this development, the use of the California and Oregon Trail that cut through the heart of Shoshone land, I think my people had three options: beg for food, starve, or steal. My grandmother always said, "Darren, we never stole anything. We were always collecting rent." I like that. You now have two different people living two different lifestyles. In early January of 1863, the Saints that were living in Cache Valley began writing letters to Salt Lake City for someone to come take care of the Indian depredations. Arrest warrants were issued for Chief Bear Hunter, Pocatello, and Sagwitch. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his troops from California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, were now mustered into service. A Mormon scout named Porter Rockwell led the troops north of where I live today, where Battle Creek meets Bull Ogai. Chief Sagwitch, being an early riser, got up as usual on the morning of January 29th. He left his teepee and surveyed the area around his camp. He noticed the hills to the southeast appeared to have a steaming mist on the bluff on top. And then it creeped lower down the hill, and he suddenly realized what was taking place. The troops from Camp Douglas had arrived. It was below zero, 4 feet of snow, and the horses had been traveling all night long. And every time the horse would take a breath, it would let out a puff of steam, and that's what he could see. He called for his village to wake. They gathered whatever they could find to fight with. Some of the women picked up their woven winnowing pans to use them for shields. Without so much as asking for the guilty parties, Connor and his men began to fire their rifles at my people. But what are arrows compared to the rifles and sidearms of the soldiers? The soldiers began massacring men, women, and children. My grandmother said that they were being slaughtered like wild rabbits. The massacre started early in the morning and lasted until early afternoon. The Bear River, that was slightly frozen short time earlier, was now starting to flow. Many of our people were jumping into the river to try to escape. You can imagine the brilliant white snow was now red with blood. The willow trees that were used as hiding places were bent down as if in defeat. Many of our women were jumping into the river to try to escape, many with their young children. Almost all of them died. There was one woman I write about in my book named Angie Chi. She was a brand new mom, had a brand new infant baby. She jumped into the river and swam under an overhanging bank. Now you might be asking yourself, how could you survive a cold winter in January in the Cache Valley? They camped next to the largest hot spring in Idaho, and the warm water, they knew where they could go to find refuge. When she got there, she found herself there with 10 other women who had the same idea. They could hear the soldiers just above their head, wondering where they'd gone. It was then that Angie Chi's baby started to cry. Angie Chi was a young mom that day. She lived at Washakie, and she lived to be more than 100 years old. And she would tell and retell this story to the children of that community, talking to the children about how she was trying to tend to the 7 bullet wounds that she'd had to her body. She also told of having to drown her own baby so it wouldn't give up their location. The cruelest killing, though, was that of Bear Hunter. Knowing that he was one of the chiefs, They'd shot him, they'd stabbed him, they'd tortured him in many ways. Through all of that, that old chief wouldn't die or even cry out for mercy or make a sound. One of the military men became angry and stepped to a burning campfire and heated his bayonet until it was glowing red. He then ran that hot piece of metal through that chief's head from ear to ear. Chief Bear Hunter went to his grave, a man of honor, but he left behind a wife and many small children. At the end of the massacre, Connor allowed a handful of saints to walk the village. James Martineau, in his journal, was sickened by what he saw. He noted that many of the squaws were killed was because they would not lie down and submit to be ravished. He later told Peter Mon of sickening accounts of inhuman acts by the soldiers and said after the Indians had been routed, they killed many of them by hitting them in the head with an axe. The next morning, at the request of Brigham Young, local Mormons William Head, William Nelson, William Hull traveled to the massacre site looking for survivors and to count how many had died. Hull later recorded in his journal, "We drove our sleighs as far as the river. The first sight to greet us was an old man walking, head bowed, heading towards the north, lamenting the dead. He didn't speak to us, and he soon left, walking towards the north. Never will I forget the scene. Dead bodies were everywhere. I counted 8 deep in one place, and in several places there were 3 to 5 deep. All in all, we 3 counted more than 450 dead, 2/3 of those being women and children. We found 2 Indian women alive whose thighs had been broken by bullets. 2 little boys and 1 little girl who looked to be about the age of 3, having received 8 bullet wounds to her tiny body. We took them on our horse to the sleigh and made them as comfortable as possible. I'm sure at this time, Sagwitch was now realizing that he lived in 2 different worlds. One group was greedy and wanted everything, especially the land. The other group only wanted to travel and live as they'd always done. One group made their wishes and dreams come true by making themselves the conqueror at the expense of a defenseless people who only wanted to be left alone. Ralph Smith, a Franklin area settler, summed up the sentiments of the local pioneers when he said, "We looked upon the massacre as gruesome, but necessary." And then added, "The work of Patrick Edward Connor and his soldiers was nothing less than an intervention from our Heavenly Father." Mary Ann Weston Mon, wife of Peter Mon, wrote in her journal, "The residents of Cache Valley regarded Connor's efforts as an imposition of providence in our behalf, and commented that the Indians had caused so much trouble that patience had ceased to be a virtue." Henry Ballard, Bishop of the Logan First Ward, wrote in his journal, "This put a quietus upon the Indians. The Lord raised up his foe in Colonel Connor to punish them without us having to do it. We had bore a great deal from them and still have been feeding them. And yet some of the wicked spirits among them would stir up trouble against us." George Farrell, secretary of the Logan Second Ward, recorded in the church's official minutes that we, the people of Cache Valley, looked upon the movement of Connor as an intervention from our Heavenly Father, as the Indians had been a source of great annoyance to us for a very long time. And finally, in a letter from Peter Mon to Brigham Young, dated February 4th, he said, "I feel my skirts rid of their blood. They rejected the way of life and salvation, which had been pointed out to them from time to time. And thus they have perished, relying upon their own strength and wisdom. Just north of Preston, Idaho today, you'll find an old monument off of Highway 91. This monument was erected in 1932 by the people of Franklin County and the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. It was meant to record the history of the events of that fateful day. This was a celebrated event. The whole community came together to tell their story and remember their history. What the monument really accomplished for me is that it gave people a reason to forget. That monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what took place. And that monument tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. You see, humans have great memories for what we want to remember. In commemorating something like this, the battle, you tend to forget the uglier parts of history. And you only focus on the heroism of the soldier and the saint. That's the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers monument that exists there today. But that narrative now becomes the story. It's not a story about my people. It becomes a story about the brave soldiers and the pioneer women who took care of them. In constructing this monument, you firm up memory and you create a false history. You decide for yourself. The plaque reads, attacks by the Indians on the peaceful inhabitants in this vicinity led to the final battle here on January 29th in 1863. The conflict occurred in deep snow and bitter cold. Scores of wounded soldiers were taken from the battlefield to the Latter-day Saint community of Franklin, Idaho. Here, pioneer women, trained through trials and necessities of frontier living, accepted the responsibility of caring for the wounded until they could be removed to Camp Douglas, Utah. Oh, and by the way, 2 Indian women found alive were given homes in Franklin. So my question to you is that really what happened? The problem with that narrative for me, among many, is that it gives us one point of view from one generation's perspective, 69 years after the actual event. It's like a view from a window that's been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of a beautiful landscape. You only get to see what they want you to see. It reinforces the view that Indians were savages, and it went so far as to label our women and children as enemy combatants. It reinforces the view that violence on the frontier was necessary for the survival of Latter-day Saint communities. And it showed what the consequences would be if both groups tried to share the same space. This past May, I met 3 4th grade classes at the monument. Just north of the monument in the same parking lot is a tree. We call it an honor tree. People will bring and leave trinkets and gifts to honor those who died that day. There's dream catchers and other things. As me and 100 4th graders were staring at this tree at close range, a 4th grade boy said, "Oh, look, there's a mirror hanging in the tree. What do you think it means?" I was scrambling at that point to come up with something clever to answer. And a little girl to my left raised her hand and said, "I know." She said, "It's here to remind us that we did this." I know. The hair on my head stood up. I looked at the teacher and she looked at me. And we were taught that day by a young child. What if the plaque had been written on that monument from the perspective of the Northwestern Band of Shoshones? Would it have read the same way? Maybe it would have said something like this: The massacre of the Northwestern Band occurred in this vicinity on January 29th in 1863. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, attacked a sleeping Indian village in the early morning hours of the day. The soldiers shot, raped, bludgeoned, and bayoneted several hundred men, women, and children to their death. The Shoshones fought back with the limited weapons available to them, but the band was all but annihilated. So, which version of the massacre is correct? The answer will lie in your perspective. The events, though, that took place on that cold January morning have long been forgotten by most. Maybe guilt or remorse has silenced all those who one day may have wanted to know the truth. But what I'm finding is that there's a new generation that has a desire to listen and to learn. And it's not because we're looking to have things made right. We're not. But I have always believed that those who died at Bear River that day have a God-given right to be heard. Their story needs to be told. Their voices speak to me from the dust. We remember and we honor the past because it allows us to succeed in the future. Someone once told me, never let your past experiences harm your future. Your past cannot be altered and your future doesn't deserve the punishment. I am grateful that past negative experiences didn't alter Chief Sagwich's future, because as his direct descendant, it would have altered mine. I believe with all my heart that the most successful Native Americans today are those who can best balance culture and change. We honor our culture. We honor those who have gone before. They are important to us. We honor them and their traditions. But as a tribal leader, I realize that we live in an ever-changing world. And it's my job to prepare our youth to change and succeed with it. The massacre at Bo'ogai has taught me many lessons over the years. It has taught me that bad things happen to people. If they haven't happened to you yet, just wait and stick around. How we respond to those events, though, will determine our character. It has taught me to offer unconditional forgiveness every time. But it doesn't mean you need to forget. It has taught me that as we preserve history, it's important that everyone's views are represented and respected. It has taught me that everyone has a story worthy of being told. What is your story going to be? Because your stories are equally as important as mine. It's taught me that the souls of my ancestors peer out from behind my mask of skin, and that through my memories, they get to live again. Tell me a fact, and I will learn. Tell me a truth, and I will believe. But tell me a story, and that will live in my heart forever. Ultimately, the story of Bear River is our story. And I hope you can respect the story that we want to have told, as well as recognize your role within that story. You see, history doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we'd all rather not have. But that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. It connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. But it always offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this, with the Shoshone people, moving forward in a way that connects us, not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to this new relationship that I think is a 21st century relationship based on respect. Respect for the truth and what happened in that past moment. Then, and only then, do you get the possibility for reconciliation. But how do we make reconciliation possible in such a seemingly divided world that we live in today, where Western values have taught us that we all have individual rights, versus indigenous values that says we all have obligations to the past, present, and future, obligations to our communities. Western worldviews are always scientific and skeptical, often requiring proof as a basis of belief. Indigenous worldviews are based on a spiritually orientated society. This is a system based in the belief that all things are spiritual. To Native people, land and water are spiritual. Western worldviews say that there's only one truth based on science. Indigenous worldviews say there can be many truths. Truths are dependent upon the individual's experiences. Western worldviews has a way of compartmentalizing society. Indigenous worldviews say that societies operate in a state of relatedness. Everything and everyone is related. Western worldviews say that the land and water and its resources should be available for development, extraction, and depletion. Indigenous worldviews believe that the land and water is sacred and is only given to us by our Creator to be carefully and lovingly maintained. Western worldviews judge your success by how well you achieve your goals. Indigenous worldviews judge your success by the quality of your relationships with people. Western worldviews say that human beings are the most important things in the world. Indigenous worldviews say that human beings are not the most important thing in the world. And Western worldviews teach that amassing wealth should always be for personal gain. Indigenous worldviews say that amassing wealth is important only for the good of the community. Do you know that the Iroquois Nation leadership, they don't make any decision without considering what effects that decision would have on 7 generations ahead? Think about the implications for our future if that is how our leaders govern today. Take a look around you tonight. We're as varied and colorful as a beautiful field of wildflowers, each bringing with us our own unique characteristics. As you look around, I hope you can truly see the good in what you see. We need to be able to see each other through each other's eyes. When this happens, the possibilities are endless. The differences that we all bring to the table can be the strengths that we all draw from one another. Our life has brought us knowledge. Knowledge brings understanding. And greater understanding brings openness to other ways of seeing and being. Don't ever be afraid to forge a new path. It is important to remember that nobody is you. That is your superpower. Be the one who celebrates the different colors of our skins and embraces the opportunity that gives us to learn from one another. Be the one who breaks the cycle. If you were ever judged wrongly, choose to be understanding. If you were ever rejected, choose acceptance. If you were ever shamed, be the one who chooses compassion. Be the person you needed when things didn't go well and you were hurting, and not the person that hurt you. And always, always, instead of holding on to a grudge, be the first one to forgive. I think about the values of my native people and what lessons they can teach us today. I believe they would want us to live as one, to cherish our likenesses, but celebrate the heck out of our differences, to honor our stewardship for this earth and all things that live on it and the sky above it. They would tell us to have gratitude for the things that we have and for those who made the trails for us to follow. And they would tell us to have reverence in our hearts. They would tell us to spread the kind of love that awakens the soul, that makes each one of us reach for more, that plants the fire in our hearts and brings peace to our minds. That's the kind of love this world needs today. Love, kindness, forgiveness, acceptance. I see you. I hear you. I respect you. Those affirmations and many others like them are what I like to call medicine words. I hope we can speak medicine words to those around us, but especially to our young people. Words that bless, inspire, and empower. When we speak medicine words, we build unity and we strengthen our culture and our nation. One day, a young girl in second grade, after I'd done a presentation to her class, looked me dead in the eye, and she said, "How did you get to be the chief?" Skeptically, I may add. And I told her this story. I said, when a young Shoshone boy or girl does an act of kindness or service, the chief and the tribe would give that boy or girl one eagle feather. I then said to this little girl, what do you think would happen if that boy or girl kept doing kind things for everyone? And her answer was obvious. She said that, they would get more eagle feathers. I said, what do you think would happen if they kept doing kind things until they became an adult? She said, well, by then they would have so many eagle feathers. And I said, you're right. And I said, one day when the chief gets ready to die, and the chief is always the leader until he dies, he calls everyone together. He says, I'm about to meet my maker. I want all of you to pull out your eagle feathers and show them to me. And it was the person that had the most eagle feathers would become the new chief. You see, the chief isn't the bravest or the toughest or the strongest. The chief is always the one who led a life of service and kindness to those around him or her. So I told that little girl and the rest of the class, go be a chief today. Be a good sibling. Express gratitude for those around you. Be a good friend and be the kind of person that people want to be with. In this way, you will become a leader in your community. Leadership that's not rooted in power and authority, but in service and wisdom. But as important it is to tell the story of the people, it's equally as important to tell the story of the land. But where do you begin? How do you begin to address cultural and environmental injustices that have taken place for so long? In 2018, we were able to purchase 550 acres of that sacred burial ground. This was only the beginning of a journey to bring back what we thought was lost forever. This partnership we've developed with our people and many others has just begun. I've been told that this place of healing will be a living, learning classroom for decades to come. Our restoration work will require more than the removal of non-invasive plants and planting new ones. It will involve restoring the watersheds, which will require buy-in from those upstream. This is not a project that we can do alone. Healing begins, I believe, when you bring people together. The reality, though, of finally being able to tell our story from our perspective is powerful. The purchase of the Massacre site will help our people to reconnect to this sacred space while providing a new impetus as stewards. Voices that have been quiet for more than a century and a half are now beginning to be heard. We are going to bring back what we thought was lost forever. As important it is to tell the story of the people, it's equally as important to tell the story of the land and its restoration. And we are now just beginning to take back that narrative. And this is our story, and we will be heard. The Bear River Massacre is not just a Shoshone tragedy. It's an American tragedy. In the Shoshone response to that event, there are tools that can help heal the divides. They're found in modern, everyday American society. As the story of the massacre and its ramifications becomes better known, people will more fully recognize the significance in the experiences of others. Their empathy and understanding can grow as they see ways to forgive, integrate, and flourish while protecting their own unique values and cultures. As visitors are engaged, I hope that they will feel the echoes of the past, helping them to come to terms with the current choices and challenges that we all face in the future. The Bo-Ogai Cultural Interpretive Center, which I hope to fundraise for, will be a place of unity that welcomes all learning about the Shoshone people. We hope that those who will visit will feel empowered, respected, and peaceful. The goal of the Interpretive Center will be to tell the story of our people, to be more inclusive for everyone by creating a safe space where all can feel welcome. We want to build bridges between cultures. We want to give people a small sense of hope and resiliency. We hope to create a space for all Shoshone cultures, supporting language development, preservation of stories and lifeways, and opportunities for connection and cultural support in modern times. There will be a space where all groups can come together for special programs, discussions, and activities. But more than anything else, it'll be a place of healing. I love the prophecy of Chief Crazy Horse, who I believe could see our day and time, when he said this: upon suffering, beyond suffering, the Red Nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing to a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separation, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all of the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. In that day, there will be those among my native people who will carry knowledge and understanding of unity among all living things. And the young white ones will come to those of my people and ask for this wisdom. I salute the light in your eyes, where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at that center within you, and I am in that place within me, we shall be as one. I think the words of Crazy Horse are prophetic. Like many Native American leaders who went before, and many who I believe will come again, with or without the church's blessing. And if we're ever going to have a chance to save this world, I believe we need this wisdom now more than ever. The assumption that scientific knowledge is superior in some way to indigenous wisdom is not only harmful, but it can be a barrier to meaningful and lasting collaboration. Scientists are finally discovering what indigenous leaders have taught for generations, that we are all connected. Politicians are finally discovering what the Iroquois already knew, that we must govern for the benefit of the future generations. This is what the young activists are saying when they demand climate justice. We cannot sacrifice the future for the sake of short-term goals and profits. There's not enough science in the world that will overcome selfish behaviors. We are in the midst of a massive paradigm shift. Now is the time to braid indigenous wisdom and knowledge and values about stewardship and cutting edge, combine that with cutting edge science. There's an old Indian proverb that says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. These, I think, are difficult times, but what brings me hope is that thousands of people are coming together to say that our human being is connected to the well-being of our environment. And the well-being of our environment is connected to the well-being of the watershed and the climate. We are truly all connected. And the actions that we take in the next decade will affect generations to come. Let's stay active. Let's stay engaged and keep coming together to protect and steward our natural resources and each other. Thank you.
That was beautiful, man. I think this Manic Shoshone chief ought to be our chief of America.
I'm not running again. No.
Separate
No way.
choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So,
Thank you.
Let's see what questions we might have here, and then on Zoom. I'm going to stand over here so I can just see.
Okay,
You can
okay.
actually see right
Oh,
here.
but, oh, I can't read it.
Well, yeah, okay, stay up here though.
Says why.
So, well, what would you like to share in terms of what you heard tonight with Darren?
And if you don't have questions, that's okay. Oh, yes.
I was just curious, as you talked about the plaque there and the way the scenario it talks about, has that been altered or added to or changed
No,
to
but
reflect more of the truth?
the original plaque hasn't. They left it there. But 2 years ago, they put up a new plaque on the backside. And they actually asked me to draft up what a plaque would say if I could write it. And I wrote it, and they took like one sentence out of it, which is typical. But it actually, the first sentence says, here in this vicinity, more than 400 Shoshones were massacred. Men, women, and children were massacred. Doesn't matter what it says after that. At least people that go there, if they take the time to walk around the backside of it, will see what we think really happened. And in a year or two, when I get the rest of the money raised, we'll build a building that will tell our story anyway. So, yes.
When you mentioned the plaque, it reminded me of James W. Bowman's Wise Across America, where he did a survey of more sites throughout the country and point out how many of the Confederacy, basically celebrating Confederate generals who didn't even live in these areas. And nothing to do with local history, but there's a concerted effort to rewrite history, which I guess maybe about 100 years ago. So basically rewrite the whole So work history, but in many respects, not good. Same here too, the whole history of the West was people talk about revisions and they basically just want to say, well, we were the good guys, and we want, and we don't want to talk about it. So,
Sure. Yeah. We're almost getting back to that way too.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not from Utah, and I really didn't know anything about the story. Your story really touched me, and all I can think about is there's so many people I know who need to hear this story. Is this something that? Oh, okay. There's a book. Got it.
For sale.
But is this, do you talk about this from time to time? Or,
Yeah.
How can I somehow get these other people?
I probably talk 3 or 4 times a week about the story.
Okay.
And, but I'll never turn down a chance. Do you want to get a group together that want to hear this story? I'd be more than happy to share and come down and do whatever we want. Yeah, Rachel.
Sort of related, but my experience, I tried to do work in, reconstructing stuff that was left out of what I was taught and try to share that. And there are people who take the opposite. First, they accuse you of being the one who's devising history. And then they just can't. They just can't basically face this other perspective. And it's just too much. And have you found that there are ways to get around this aversion?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, because I have a lot of loud, angry Native American friends. Look, if my grandmother was here giving this talk, it would have been completely different. She was angry. She wouldn't even say Connor's name. And so, but what I found is it's okay to talk about hard things and bring people to the edge of uncomfortableness. But look, I mean, we can't change the past, first of all. And if I could, I would. But since we can't change it, what can we do moving forward together to make this world a better place? How can we learn from it? And by dwelling on it and being angry about it, that's certainly a way to do it. And I'm certainly not, it's just not my way. And for my loud Native American friends that are still angry, I see them and respect them for the way they do things, but it's just not my way. And I think I've been way better received by being able to be civil about it and look for ways to come together about it. I mean, I've never found somebody to be disagreeable after I've spoke ever, because I don't dwell on the past. I'm not angry about it. I'm sad about it. And I wish we would come together and learn from it, because I think there's certain lessons of life to be learned from it. But for me, it's always about moving forward, moving past. Let's learn from it and move past that and talk about other things, and much that we have in common. But certainly don't forget it. I mean, we're not going to erase it, and we never should erase it. But we should be able to talk about it civilly. And even if the other day in church, I live down in Avon, south end of Cache Valley. And I said in church, I am positive, and there are 50 people in there, that I don't share the same politics with any of you. I am positive of that. But I love you, and we get along and we make it work, because there's that we have much more in common than we don't. And as long as we're focusing on that, we're in a good place.
So I say it's also not just past the other side of expropriation land, which is there's a story in basically, I don't know, you know, the story, but East versus on this carrot, simply the same people. This is like people, audiences, people who didn't understand what they were there for, what they were doing, saying basically, this land is now belongs to the Roman Catholic Church, and you must now submit yourselves to the Pope or something.
Yeah.
Wait,
Yeah.
okay, go ahead, Walter, and then we'll take a
Take
couple
a
of questions
question.
from the Zoom audience. Go ahead.
So I was wondering, at that time, where did your people, like, where did they live? Because they were semi-nomadic, so where else? Because I'm just interested in the geography of places.
Cache Valley was always kind of home base, and we wintered in the Cache Valley, which is not the warmest place in the world after 5 winters there. But they camped on, because it was hot springs, a lot of hot springs, and that's why they camped there. We traveled to, in fact, I did this with my grandmother many times as a young boy. We'd go out to the City of Rocks area in Nevada, to the pinyon pines and collect pine nuts. We'd knock them out of the tree with sticks and roast them on a fire right there and then. And so we traveled to Salmon, Idaho, to when the salmon were in the river. We went to hunt buffalo with the Eastern Shoshones, Chief Washakie and his group at the Wind River area. He never lived in the Wind Rivers till later in life. He was more Rock Springs, Wyoming area. And so we just traveled in this geographical area. The treaty of 1863 and 68 ceded us land in Nevada, Idaho, Wyoming, up into Jackson, that called out this territory of our people's roaming, and into Colorado and Utah. Salt Lake City would have been our southern boundary. And in your land acknowledgement, people always mention, they're careful to mention the Paiutes. If the Paiutes were here, they were lost. So just, I'm telling you. Yeah, Kenny.
Darren, tell me, I apologize, I don't know all of the history really well. I find that a lot of fascinating stuff. Tell me about any cooperation or resistance from some of the other groups, some of the other tribes, the Utes and
The Utes were pretty tough. They sold a lot of children. They'd steal a lot of Shoshone children and sell them to pioneers, actually. And
Slavery was very.
yeah, it was a big thing. And so the Utes were pretty brutal to the Shoshone people. You would think we would get along. Not so much. I mean, even today, there's just weird things. You think we could help each other, but we really don't.
as far as what you're doing now, as far as getting the groups together or having them move forward with a lot of this great marriage message.
Yeah.
What are you striving for as far as a lot of us whites ought to accept and admit the wrongdoing, the atrocities? But as far as, I don't know if the government is trying to, I mean, what are you trying to accomplish?
I think,
As far as government
Yeah.
programs, or reparations, or, you know what I'm saying?
well, I'm not holding my breath for any reparations from the government or the church, first of all. I think what I'm trying to do is share the story of a people whose story has never been told before.
And if someone's going to help.
Yeah, but that relates to any culture. I mean, any marginalized group that has never had a seat at the table or a voice. There's many of cultures that fits. And so if I can shine a little light on a group of people that's never had their story told and be able to get a seat at the table, which we've been able to, I just think it bodes well for society in whole. And by speaking about these things, I just think it makes our communities better. And so that's the goal for me. Certainly not monetary. First, do you want to read a couple and then we'll
Let me
take
read a
this
couple
one?
here as a way. Thank you, Ally. How did the Shoshone recover or try to after the massacre? That's a story you didn't cover. It's in here.
Well, yeah, I wrote in my book, and I didn't cover it tonight because it's a
You can
whole
only have
nother
that.
meeting.
It's an amazing story.
But just briefly, 10 years after the massacre, the whole tribe ended up joining the LDS Church. Mass baptism, 102 Shoshones in one day, led by their chief, Sagwitch. Now, most of my friends are academics. They're professors, college professors. And I tell them, well, then maybe they joined the church out of spiritual reasons. And they go, BS, and I won't tell you what they say, but they were saving their own butt. They wanted to stay. And I'm okay with that reason too. I mean, if I'm a smart leader and I'm thinking, I would love to stay here in the area, the only area we've ever known. And the alternative is to get moved to a faraway place that's crappy land anyway. If I can stay here, I'll pretty much do whatever we need to do. And so they assimilated. After the baptism, they moved us to a community called Washakie, a little town site north of Tremont, in Utah. That community was there from 1880 to 1960. My dad was born and raised there. And so our people had nothing but good experiences there. The cost, language, and culture. We assimilated, and we were farmers, and we were this or that. And we learned to make a buck like anybody else. But it came at a devastating cost to the culture and the language. That's why we have 6 or 7 full speakers today. And we're not going to lose the language because the Eastern Shoshones are our cousins and speak our language. And there's 5,000 speakers. And we've started a language revitalization program within our tribe. And I used to speak it fluently with my grandmother, but without speaking it, it wasn't a written language. It just became really difficult, but I'm relearning. I can do a lot of prayers in Shoshone still, but and songs, know a lot of songs in Shoshone, but we're working on that.
So
But
Darren,
that was the cost.
so how would you view the stories that you've carried forward and collected? Do you consider them of equal weight as the stories that you talk about in terms of Sagwitch's visions and other tribal visions that caused them, I mean, from what you say in the book, to join the church? So there was the saving in the butt, but there was also, it sounded like spiritual manifestations that.
Well, and
This
yeah, I
sounds-
don't want to downplay it because my
Fairly.
academic friends, but
Right.
the story goes, Sagwitch and some of the chiefs were having spiritual manifestations. And the story in our family goes, Sagwitch was visited by 3 men in his dream that told him of a God among the Mormon people. And they told him to send for missionaries that would teach him what they needed to do. And so Sagwitch did that. He actually went to Ogden and met George Washington Hill. He knew of a man that lived in Ogden that spoke Shoshone fluently, that had been a missionary in 1855. And Sagwitch said, you need to come teach us. And he said, I'm not a missionary anymore. And so, and that's another whole hour of what happened, but
It's a fascinating story. That all
it's,
that
it's,
stuff.
yeah,
It's-
but still, so,
Yeah, that's, okay, Ally.
yeah.
It's difficult that you are talking to elementary school. How does that come about? Are teachers approaching you?
Yeah,
Or
I've never reached out to anybody. Last year I spoke at 70 elementaries.
mostly in Cache Valley?
No, all over. I've been to Provo's about this furthest south I've been. But if I get invited, I'll go. Gas prices are killing me lately, but I just go and I take artifacts and I show the kids and teach them about brain tanning, and they think that's the coolest thing ever. Spread the animal brains on the hide and it makes it soft. I let them touch all the hides first and then say, well, they brain tanned it. And it's like, ooh. But it's just important to me to share the culture, especially with the youth. I think I've been to every elementary in Cache.
And do you
But-
tell them, I mean, depending age?
Yes, I'm very age appropriate on what I share. The fourth graders don't get a massive dose of Massacre at all. But this school that girl said that's a school that's located on the Utah State's campus. It's called Edith Bowen Experimental. I mean, they do a lot of cutting edge stuff. And some of those kids are amazing what they're learning. They get a lot of hands-on in the field type experiences, which I wish everybody did, but.
So this is related to your question about Ally, is besides you going around and telling everybody, what other resources are available for people to learn about these things?
My
And your
book,
book.
first of all, which is $10 on Amazon. So
It is a great book. It's a great read. You've written it very well.
there's not a lot of things from the Shoshone perspective. There's just not many people out there telling the story. I don't want to self-promote here at all, but I've got a ton of stuff on YouTube. I didn't put it there. It just ends up there. A lot of the lectures I give at BYU and other universities around the country end up on platforms like that. I got invited to go speak in Copenhagen, October 7th, to a climate conference. I'm the keynote speaker, talking about indigenous wisdom and climate and in the environment. And so I'm so excited about that. But yeah, just lots of opportunities to share this. And I absolutely bought into, I've been just solely focused on the history and the massacre for so long. But man, I'm really dialed into the Great Salt Lake now and the environment lately. I'll still talk about the massacre whenever we need to, but we've got to do some things. Seriously.
You take Darren, you have so the Grandma May, these games can see Grandma May, marvelous space, and you do.
I do. Yeah, I do. I do. Yeah, because that's a Better Days 2020 really promoted May. It was a good thing I had a couple of friends on there that really ran with that. And so my grandmother's, I think at Trolley Square is a big picture of Sagwitch too, that I've heard about. So I haven't seen, but. So we're getting a lot more exposure than we ever have, which is a good thing.
Why don't you have a venue, something right here where
Like
Well, so
Your
for your,
foundation.
yeah, your foundation, do you have, so we can come into that?
we have a website. We have a website dedicated to the fundraising. We
And
do
what is
that.
that website?
booguy.org.
Okay, I'll put that when I put the
B
recording on.
O, yeah.
I'll get that
Okay.
exactly.
We're geezers, we can't remember that here.
It's okay.
He'll take
put it
care
on
of
the
it.
website so that, and your TED Talk
I'm a-
is on the website too.
Yeah, it is a TED Talk on that too. So
So there's some resources that I asked him for and put on there that you can go to. And then you have this recording that I'll hopefully be able to cobble together after the front end and the back end.
well, I'll send you my talk too if you want.
Yes, sir. Was it Josh?
Yeah.
John, sorry.
Yeah, so really great things that I've heard your talk about. First I want to really commend the Interpretive Center, and I really hope that project gets off the ground. In terms of sort of your comments on just that cost of the loss of language, what's your sort of opinion about the Hughes Shoshone language program, and where it was successful and where it wasn't necessarily so successful, and what can be done by institutions of higher education to sort of assist with this reclamation process?
Well, first of all, I think the University of Utah taking a stab at the language, and if you just Google Shoshone language, it'll pull up the University of Utah study. And for once, a professor took time to interview elders, and I think it's done really well, really well. The Eastern Shoshones worked with Montana State University and developed a phone app. And so you can download a free app on your phone that teaches you Shoshone. And that's another good way. And you actually look up a word hello and hit on it, and a tribal elder is saying it. Ha, that's how you say hello, ha. And so they've just taken it one step further just by pronouncing all these different words. Now, that's limited to just the most popular words, animals, places, that type of thing. And so I'd like to see more language programs. The problem is who's going to teach them is
How many are there?
how many, oh my gosh, I wouldn't even know. I mean, there's 580 federally recognized tribes. I know the Goshutes speak our language fluently. They speak Shoshone. And I heard, I went to the Natural History Museum and heard a Mayan woman from Mexico gave a seed blessing. And her language, I could understand some of it. That Uto-Aztecan language family. Oh my gosh, it gave me chills because I was expecting Spanish to come out of this little woman. She was this big, come out of her mouth, and it was completely familiar. And it was amazing to see, but it's all that family of languages. Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you for the gentleness of your voice. And I think that helps. You have to speak these harsh words of this story. It's so painful, but you do it with this beautiful kind of warmth and love. And I really enjoyed that and appreciate that.
Thank
I
you.
want to ask you, you say you sing a lot of songs. I'm a songwriter and a musician, and I'm just wondering, did the songs carry through even though there was the assimilation? Did some of it old songs?
Yeah, a lot of it did, and they've been passed down. But our generation, I mean, my kids just aren't interested in it. You know, I mean, some of them are, some of them more than others. I'll tell you, my grandkids are way interested in it. And maybe I didn't do a good job of teaching my own kids, but my grandkids are amazing. And so I have hope for my grandkids, not so much my kids, but
Do you gather as a tribe?
we do gather probably 4 or 5 times a year. We have 550 members, but when we all gather, most of our tribe are 1/4 or 1/8.
Yeah.
And that blood quantum thing was never a native thing. It's a government required thing. But when you don't live on a reservation and you don't date other Shoshones, we're going to breed ourselves out of a tribe in 2 generations unless we change the blood quantum. And we can. Like the Cherokee, you just have to prove you're a descendant. And so that's why there's 300,000 of them. That's why I meet a Cherokee every day. If I tell them I'm a Native American, they go, well, I've got Native American blood too. And I go, Cherokee? Yeah. But just because it doesn't take much to, well, you have to be a descendant, but.
I will ask you this, my brother and I, being musicians, there's a wonderful documentary that was recently released. I think it's pretty recent, but we watched it, of the impact of Native Americans on rock and roll music.
I have that DVD.
It's fantastic.
That's even old school today, DVD.
Oh my gosh, it's just
Yeah.
amazing.
It's called Rumble.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Uh,
Rumble.
Yeah, the Chickasaw produced something too called Tiata. Watch that. Oh my gosh,
Watch one.
like Tiata.
Okay. Tiana.
It's a true story. And the Chickasaw Nation has their own film production. They did it themselves.
Great.
And so Tiata is about a true story about a young Native girl back when they were very discriminated against, made it all the way to Broadway
Oh,
and performed at the White House for Franklin Roosevelt.
Wow.
wow.
and really changed how Native Americans were perceived.
The chick, the Dixie chick?
No, no. Her name's Tiara. That's the name of the show. It is a wonderful, I mean, you want a feel-good movie, that's it. So
Darren, I have a question. So you mentioned this when we were talking earlier. What does keep you engaged with the LDS Church? I mean, you have your own particular difficult history with it. People have theirs. But
we were talking about this before everybody got here. And last week I went to a symposium at the University of Utah. They just hosted it. So a friend of mine, Farina King, she's Navajo. She's a professor at Oklahoma. She just got a job at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. And she teaches Native American history, but we did it on Lamanite identity in the church. And I'll tell you, it was the coolest thing I've ever been to. And there were probably 40 presenters over 3 days. And I was invited to go. Out of the 40 presenters, probably 35 had left the church over the Lamanite identity thing. I'm one that hasn't. And I'll tell you, I get asked every day how I can stay. And it's easy for me. I mean, and where I fall on the Lamanite identity thing, look, it's really problematic. I mean, the whole white and delightsome and talks by President Kimball, and not good stuff out there. Here's my take. I have a firm testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That I'm unshaken in. Man, not so much. I think leaders, men, screw it up all the time. And I can't think of one instance in the Bible where a prophet didn't get reprimanded for making a mess of things all the time. So I'm going, well, is that only in the Bible or could it be today? I look at our leaders as men who were raised a certain way, have certain biases they were raised with. I mean, and they bring some of that to the calling. Unless they say, God told me to tell you this, and most of the time they never say that, you're getting personal feelings. And so, and I think we all have the right to discern for ourselves what's good and what's bad in all of that. So the gospel to me, I'm solid, but man, I have a hard time with some things that come out of leaders' mouths and other things, but that's how I can stay. For now, I'm teasing.
well, about time. Oh, did you have one more question?
Yes.
Real quick.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just want to your point about sort of, yeah, the Lamanite identity. I wonder at that conference were there people from sort of like Polynesian backgrounds, and it's been very interesting to me to sort of research how back in the day, a lot of the brethren would like extend that Lamanite identity.
To the Poly, yeah. There were 5 Polynesians from the islands at this symposium.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to comment on that. But
I do.
I find it interesting. There's still that sort of experience of colonization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the first Polynesian presenters says, well, Hagoth, who they think is we're descendants, he was a Nephite, so that blows everything out of the water right there. He wasn't a Lamanite ever. He was a Nephite, so that's debunked. That was the first thing out of his mouth. I thought, okay. I don't know any better. That sounds good to me. And so, yeah.
But I guess this is all DNA research is opening some barriers.
And Thomas Murphy, who came up with he was there too. I love him, by the way. I don't know if I buy into everything. I just think it's more complicated than we just know. And that's how I choose to look at it today. And until somebody till I hear from the source, I'll just keep going with it. Yeah.
Did you have any thoughts or questions?
That's
Okay.
my-
She's here for the refreshments.
That's my daughter.
Yeah, that's, I know.
I have never met her. I've never met her.
And she is wanted to be here.
Oh,
Actually, I noticed that you were on the Utah History Museum,
uh-huh.
and I know that they're doing the museum behind the Capitol. So I would hope that a lot of these voices and these, or untold stories are going to be represented.
I'm a little ticked off with that. I mean, they had a committee set up to kind of study what they should do there. Not one Native American was on it. And I thought, I said to the person that's over state history, Jennifer Ortiz, I had breakfast with her, at the Oasis, which is really good, by the way. I said, how come there were no Native Americans on this committee? Well, it was just kind of a committee formed to look at how we might go forward. It's not really what we're gonna do. So, well, I mean, you can't tell the history of Utah without talking about the 8 indigenous tribes that were here for thousands of years before you guys. So let's just make sure we're all invited at the table when we talk about what that should look like. Because everybody's voice should be included.
But I know the architects for the exhibit.
Okay. Yeah, I'm hopeful they do the right thing.
What a good word in for him.
Well, thank you, everyone. If you want a book, I've got it, Venmo, or they're $10, or I'll sign it and give it to you. Or if you just want one and don't have the money, I'll give you one anyway. So thanks for coming.
Before you sit down, do you feel comfortable offering a small song? A prayer then? A prayer in your life?
Yeah, I can do a prayer. I'll do a prayer.
I would love to.
When I do a song, I like to have the drum. I just,
We got drums
I
back
have
there.
a drum.
I know, but let's close with the Shoshone prayer. and then
Okay, I love that.
Okay. Yan ishike yan tamapa. Onyo yoshike here. Dono zanda yeshe. Tamapa noche yan hishi. Jesus Christ. Yan hishike yashi no hishi. Tanzai zan no so. Tamapa. Onyo yeshe ya. Onyo yeshe. Hey.
Thank you.
Tamapa is the Great Spirit, in case. And we didn't have a word for Jesus Christ, so it's Jesus Christ.
We noticed that. It's stuck out.
I know, hear an old elder praying sometimes, and then all of a sudden they bust out in an English word. It's kind of weird, but thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Darren. That was just gorgeous. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and you can have your book purchased and signed. And thanks for those who are on Zoom. Appreciate that, and hopefully you'll come again. So you can go to the website, ThinkAgain-FaithAgain.life. All right, good night.